Lonely rancher found an Apache warrior girl caged at auction for $5 and gave her his ranch and his name. Dust Hollow, summer of 1867. The sun hung like fire above the plains, scorching the dirt until it cracked and curled. Heat shimmered off the rooftops of the half-dead town, and the air was thick with dust and sweat. Near the grain warehouse a crowd had gathered, miners, drifters, cattlemen, and housewives with faces tight as tanned hide. The building, once used for storing oats and feed, now held a different cargo. $3, $3.50, the auctioneer called, voice sharp, bouncing off the warped walls of the warehouse. Frank Boone stood just outside the general store, holding a coil of rope in one hand and a bag of coffee beans in the other. He had not planned to stop, but the noise pulled him. Something in the tone, a fevered hunger, made him turn. He stepped closer, boots scuffing the dusty ground. Inside the warehouse, the source of the commotion sat in a rusted iron cage. She was young, 19, maybe 20. Her skin was bronze under bruises, her face narrow, proud, blood crusted at her temple. One cheek was swollen. Her wrists were bound in front of her with worn leather straps, and she sat perfectly still, eyes forward, refusing to look at the crowd. "Nakoa," someone murmured in the crowd. "Apache scout, they caught her east of Dry Rock." Frank's jaw set. $3.75, the auctioneer shouted. "Do I hear $4?" Sweat ran down Frank's neck. The girl didn't blink. A fly landed on her cheek. She did not flinch. The sun beat down through the broken warehouse roof, casting sharp lines across her bare shoulders. He stepped forward without thinking, dropped his rope and coffee in the dirt, and shrugged off his leather coat. He walked up to the cage. The crowd shifted, whispering, but Frank said nothing. He just leaned down and gently draped the coat across the top of the cage to block the sun. Nakoa's eyes flicked to his face, just for a second. She did not speak. $4, someone yelled. Frank straightened. $5. The auctioneer blinked. $5, do I hear more than 5? Murmurs rippled. Laughter. Someone jeered. That rancher's been too long in the sun. Frank reached into his pocket, pulled out the small pouch he carried. He poured the coins into his palm. $4 silver. That was all. The auctioneer squinted. "You better have all 5, mister." Frank said nothing. The crowd began to laugh, louder now. Some booed. A hand touched Frank's elbow. He turned. It was Marshall Tucker. He wore a dusty brown suit, the collar open, spectacles slipping down his nose. His hair was silver, his face kind. Marshall looked at him, then pressed a single silver coin into Frank's hand. He leaned close, speaking low. "Do not let your conscience borrow trouble it cannot repay." Frank nodded once. Not in thanks, just in understanding. He turned and held up the full $5. The auctioneer shrugged. "Sold, to the man with the long shadow." Frank stepped forward. A deputy unlocked the cage. The chains dropped. He crouched beside the girl. "My name's Frank," he said quietly. "I'm not here to hurt you." She didn't answer. He didn't expect her to. He offered his hand. She didn't take it. So he stood, waited, then turned and walked toward his horse. A moment passed. Then came the sound of slow, uneven footsteps behind him. And the crowd watched in silence as the rancher rode out of Dust Hollow with a broken Apache girl walking beside him, a leather coat still draped over her cage, now empty. Frank took the paper the deputy handed him, a crumpled certificate of sale with ink barely dry and the girl's name misspelled, and shoved it into his coat pocket without a glance. He did not want to read it. He did not want to see the words that tried to make what just happened sound legal. He stepped to the cage and knelt, not touching the bars, not rushing. The girl inside sat unmoving, her eyes locked forward, jaw tight. "I'm Frank," he said, voice quiet but steady. "I won't hurt you." She didn't answer, but her gaze shifted. It wasn't trust, but it wasn't defiance anymore. It was calculation, a wild thing measuring distance before the bite. He didn't expect her to speak. He just unlocked the cage, then stepped back. She sat for a beat longer, then crawled out slowly, like a coyote limping from a trap. Her knees shook. She didn't fall. Frank walked ahead, retrieved his rope and coffee from the dirt. The crowd had begun to scatter. No one spoke to him. No one met his eye. They reached his horse, a chestnut mare with kind eyes, and Frank offered his hand again. She looked at it, then climbed up without help. Outside of town, they reached a stream hidden by willow and cottonwood. Frank stopped beside it, tied off the mare, and stepped into the shallow water. He filled a tin canteen and knelt beside her. "You're bleeding," he said. Still no words. He reached into his saddlebag, pulled out a clean cloth and soaked it. Then, slowly, gently, he lifted her wrist. She tensed but didn't pull away. He wiped the blood from the raw skin, careful not to press too hard. Then her shoulder, where the bruise had turned dark purple, and a cut on her temple. "You can tell me to stop," he murmured. She didn't. He saw it then, the flicker of something in her eyes. Not gratitude, not yet, but recognition that he was doing this not because he had to, but because it was right. They rode on until the sun dipped behind the hills. Frank's stomach growled, and he guessed hers had not known food in days. In town again, he led the mare to the front of a small diner, 2 tables outside, smell of beans and pork fat in the air. He tied the reins, motioned for her to follow. Inside, the room went quiet. A woman behind the counter stared. A man near the stove stood, arms crossed. Neither said anything. Frank waited. Then the woman spoke. "She ain't eatin' here." Frank's jaw clenched. "I said she ain't eatin' here." He didn't argue, just turned around, walked outside, untied the reins. Down the road, a bell above a small door rang as they passed under it. The sign read, "Merriweather's Bread and Brew." Inside, warm light touched the shelves of bread and jars of jam. A single table stood near the window. From the back emerged a woman in a faded blue dress and apron, gray hair pulled into a loose bun. Her eyes softened the moment she saw the girl. "Sit down," she said, no hesitation. Frank hesitated. "You sure?" "Of course," she said. "No one deserves to eat alone." They sat. A bowl of stew was placed in front of Nakoa. Steam curled into the air. She stared at it. Frank waited. She picked up the spoon. Her hand trembled. She did not lift it right away. Her lips parted, then closed again. She glanced at the woman, then at Frank, then back to the bowl. Then, slowly, she dipped the spoon, brought it to her mouth and sipped. Her eyes closed. Not from pleasure, but from something else. Memory, maybe, or disbelief. A drop of broth trembled on her lip. Frank looked away, suddenly ashamed of how much it moved him. When she opened her eyes again, there was water in them. But she didn't cry. She took another bite, slower, her hands steadier, and across the table Frank saw, not the warrior, not the captive, but a girl who had once known hunger, and now remembered what it was to be seen. By morning, Dust Hollow buzzed with the kind of whispers that turned ordinary men into monsters, and fear into fuel. The tale twisted faster than facts, bending itself into whatever shape the speaker needed. By breakfast, it had become legend. Frank Boone, the recluse rancher, paid $5 for a savage Apache girl. Said he planned to keep her as his wife. They spoke it over bacon grease and stale biscuits, behind cracked windows and under the low hush of church porches. They repeated it at water barrels and in line at the mercantile, with voices lowered just enough to feel like virtue. Some said he'd lost his mind. Others said he'd always been dangerous. A few murmured that she'd bewitched him. It didn't matter that no one had asked Frank, or that Nakoa hadn't spoken a word to any of them. Truth moved slow. Gossip rode faster than horses. That afternoon, Frank saddled the mare and helped Nakoa up behind him. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't ask anything. She just rode in silence, her arms never quite touching his sides, her gaze sharp on the road ahead. As they entered the town's main street, the change in the air was immediate. The chatter died. A child laughed and was hushed. Men paused with mugs halfway to their lip. Women turned their backs, whispering without words. Some stared openly, their faces pinched with disgust. Others looked away, ashamed or afraid to be seen looking. Frank kept his eyes forward, jaw set. He had never liked crowds. Today he hated them. Beside him, Nakoa walked with quiet defiance. She did not hide. Her spine remained straight, her chin level. But her shoulders were coiled tight, and she scanned everything, like a hunted thing that refused to run. At the general store, Frank picked up flour, salt, and a tin of nails. He placed them on the counter and set down coins, exact and counted. The shopkeeper's wife stared at him, then at Nakoa. Her face turned cold. "You can take your things," she said, pushing the bag toward him, "but she ain't welcome in here." Frank didn't speak. He didn't argue. He simply took the bag, turned, and walked out. He only spoke when his hands had no fight left in them. Outside, as they passed the blacksmith's barn, a man leaning against a post let a long line of spit fall near Nakoa's boots. Another muttered something under his breath, low and sharp, but the meaning was clear, even if the words weren't. Nakoa slowed. Her hands curled slightly, not in fear, in readiness. Frank placed a hand gently on her elbow. "Keep walking," he said. His voice was calm, but not soft. A line drawn in dirt. They reached the edge of town and stopped beneath a tall cottonwood. The leaves whispered above them, caught in a breeze that finally broke the heat. The shade was thin but welcome. Frank sat on a flat stone, reached into his coat pocket. His fingers brushed the folded paper, the receipt of sale he still hadn't thrown away, then deeper, to a small, round tin. He opened it and pulled out a single wrapped caramel. The paper had softened from age, edges fraying. He unwrapped it halfway and held it out. Nakoa looked at it warily, as if unsure if it was a trick. "It's sweet," he said. "My mother used to give me one whenever I scraped my knee or had a rough day. Said it wouldn't fix anything, but it might help me wait until it did." She stared at the candy, then at him. Then, slowly, she took it. She unwrapped it the rest of the way with quiet hands and placed the caramel in her mouth. Her face remained unreadable at first, chewing mechanically, lips still, eyes distant, but then something shifted. Her shoulders dropped just a fraction, her jaw relaxed, and then barely, her mouth curved. Not much, not long, but enough. Frank didn't smile. He just looked out over the horizon, where the hills turned gold and the sky threatened rain. In the silence, shaded by judgment and dust, a single piece of candy passed between two strangers, and for the first time since the cage, Nakoa let her face remember something other than pain. Not hope, not trust, just sweetness. Enough for now. The sun had just begun its slow descent behind the ridge when Frank and Nakoa walked into Harlan's Tap, a one-room watering hole at the edge of Dust Hollow, where men came to drink, spit, and share bad ideas. The room went still the moment they entered. Frank said nothing, just nodded once to the barkeep, and led Nakoa to the far corner table. She sat with her back to the wall, eyes scanning the room with the quiet focus of someone who had survived too many ambushes. They hadn't come for trouble, just water and a little peace. But trouble was already seated at the far end of the bar. Jedediah Voss, dusty boots propped on a stool, long coat draped over one shoulder, turned his head slowly. His son Reed lounged beside him, smirking, his thumbs hooked in his belt. Across from them stood Clay Danner, a wiry man with miner's hands and a temper known from Dead Creek to Silver Hollow. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," Clay said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Frank didn't answer. "You goin' deaf, Boone?" Reed asked, "or just too proud to speak when you bring one of them animals indoors?" Nakoa's fingers tightened around her glass. Jedediah stood slowly. He was older, heavier, but carried the authority of land and money. "I won't repeat what everyone in town already knows," he said calmly, voice like gravel under a wagon wheel. "You paid for her like you would a mule. Maybe you think that means she's yours. But there's a difference between property and parading shame." Frank looked up. His eyes were tired but steady. Jedediah stepped closer. "You know what she is, Boone. You know what she comes from. Blood, arrows, burned wagons. She ain't no wife. She ain't no woman to raise under the same roof as our daughters." Reed leaned in. "Just give her up. Quiet. No one needs to get hurt." Frank stood. Not fast, not slow, just enough to remind the room that he was still bigger than most of them. That his silence wasn't fear, it was choice. "She's not mine," he said, "because she's not anyone's." Clay scoffed. "That's not how this works." Frank's voice dropped. "She's not a beast, not a prize. And she sure as hell doesn't need forgiveness from men who would have caged her and called it justice." Jedediah's face hardened. Reed reached for something under his coat. Frank stepped forward, placing himself between Nakoa and the room. "You touch her," he said, voice flat, "and you'll have to step over me to do it." The silence that followed was brittle. Reed hesitated. Jedediah held up a hand. "This ain't over," he said. Frank nodded once. "Good. Then you can spend tonight thinking hard about whether your pride is worth dying for." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't draw his gun, but no one else moved. He and Nakoa walked out without a word, the door creaking shut behind them. Inside, the tension lingered, sharp as a drawn blade, and for the first time in a long while, Frank Boone was not just a man with land. He was a man with something he was willing to die for. The wind picked up just after sundown, carrying with it more than dust. It brought a kind of silence that pressed against the ribs, the kind of quiet that was not calm but coiled. It crept through the trees and over the fields like something searching, something waiting. Frank sat at the edge of the porch, a piece of leather strap in his lap and a tin of oil open beside him. His fingers moved with quiet purpose, looping and polishing, but his eyes kept flicking to the horizon. Inside the cabin, Nakoa fed the fire with slow, methodical movements. The pot simmered, scent of stew drifting into the night, but neither of them was truly hungry. The moon was already up, full and yellow, swollen like it had something to say. Then came the knock. Not tentative, not polite. It slammed against the wood like a warning. Frank stood, his hand already at the rifle propped against the wall. He opened the door without a word. Bob Merriweather stood on the porch, bonnet askew, shawl thrown over her shoulders, breathing like she had run the whole way from town. "They're coming," she said, voice rasping with urgency. "Jedediah, his boy, a few others. They've been drinking, but they're not stumbling. They're furious. Said they'd take her back by force and make an example of you." Frank's mouth tightened. He didn't ask how she knew. He didn't need to. "I've got a cart behind my orchard," she continued. "Old mule, half blind but mean as sin. She'll get you west. Stay low. Don't stop." Behind him, Nakoa had already stepped into the doorway, pulling on her boot. Her eyes met his, clear, unafraid, ready. He nodded once to Ba Merriweather. "Thank you." "Go," she whispered, "before they find your trail." 10 minutes later, the mule cart rolled past the edge of Dust Hollow, wheels creaking softly, moonlight painting silver lines across the prairie. The town disappeared behind them, swallowed by trees and tension. Nakoa sat beside Frank, the rifle across his knees. Neither spoke. They crossed dry riverbeds and wound through scattered rocks, the trail rough but passable. The mule moved steadily, hooves crunching gravel like clock hands ticking too loud. Near midnight, as they curved into a narrow pass between two stone bluffs, the night cracked open. A rifle shot split the silence. The mule screamed, rearing. The cart jerked violently to one side. A wheel caught on a rut, snapping a spoke. Frank leapt down, grabbing the reins, steadying the animal. Another shot rang out, closer this time. Frank's voice was low and sharp. "Off the trail, now!" Nakoa jumped, boots landing hard. They ran, scrambling over brush and thistle, slipping through shadows. Behind them, hooves thundered. Men's voices rose, taunts and curses thrown into the dark. Frank led them through a dry wash, the ground loose beneath their feet, until they reached the foot of a steep ridge. The slope was jagged, strewn with crumbling rock and brush. "Climb," he said. She looked up. The path was narrow, treacherous. He crouched. "Step on my back." She hesitated, just for a second. "Do it." She climbed. Her hands dug into the rocks, boots pressing into his shoulders. Frank didn't flinch. He braced himself, fingers clutched in the earth, teeth grit as her weight passed over him. She reached the ledge, turned and reached down. He took her hand and hauled himself up, boots slipping, breath ragged. They collapsed beside each other in the dust at the summit. Below, voices echoed, searching, scattering, but not yet climbing. They wouldn't give up. Not now. Frank reached into his coat pocket. The old paper was still there, yellowed and soft with wear. He unfolded it. Transferred property, it read, beneath a name no one had bothered to spell right. He held it to the moonlight, stared at the thing that had once made him feel like he had done something decent, then tore it. Once. Twice. He let the pieces fall. The wind caught them, lifted them like feathers, scattered them down the cliffside into the dark. He turned to Nakoa. "You're not owned," he said, "not saved, not bought. You're free. And no man will ever say he gave you that." She looked at him. Her eyes glistened, not from fear, but from something older, something heavier. She didn't speak. Instead, she reached out, her fingers still streaked with dirt and blood, and laid them gently over the back of his hand, not in gratitude, but in recognition, as if to say, "I see you, too." Dawn came gray and cold, casting long shadows through the canyon walls. Frank and Nakoa crouched between two slabs of rock, breaths shallow, bodies pressed to stone. The path they had taken led to a natural choke point, a narrow gulch carved by centuries of rain. Now it was a trap. Ahead, Reed Voss and his men waited, rifles resting across saddles. Behind them, Clay Danner's crew circled like dogs around a pinned deer. Shouts echoed off the walls, the sound of boots scraping rock closing in. Frank loaded his rifle with steady hands, placing extra cartridges at his side. "We hold here," he said. Nakoa checked her knife, slid it back into her belt. "If they come in too close, then we make it cost them." He crouched low, positioning himself behind a flat stone ledge, his rifle aimed down the gulch. The voices came louder now, Reed's first. "Boone, you got no way out. This is your last chance. Hand her over and we walk." Frank said nothing. Another voice, Clay Danner, cruel, amused. "Come on, Frank. We'll take good care of her. Better than a mutt like you could." Frank stood slowly, rifle aimed low. "Come any closer and I'll drop the first man who breathes wrong." Laughter. Then Reed called again. "Why her, Boone? Why risk everything for a girl like that?" Frank didn't hesitate. His voice cracked like thunder across the stone. "Because I spent my whole damn life quiet, doing what was expected, letting others speak for me. And she made me want to stand up and be heard." Silence. Then Clay moved first, a gun cocked. But before it fired, another voice rang out from the top of the gulch. "Drop your weapons!" All heads turned. Marshal Tucker rode in on a white mule, flanked by two riders in dark coats and wide-brimmed hats. They carried no rifles, just leather-bound books and iron badges pinned to their lapels. Marshal raised a hand. "These two men," he gestured to the strangers beside him, "represent the Civil Rights Court of El Paso. You harm that girl, you violate Federal Statute 241. That's conspiracy to deny liberty to a free citizen. You boys want to explain that to Washington?" Reed turned pale. Clay's grip loosened. "That law's new," he growled. "Ain't even passed this county yet." "It has," Marshall said calmly, "and I've got the ink to prove it." The men looked between each other. Guns lowered. Reed tried to back away, but one of the lawyers dismounted and slipped handcuffs from his saddlebag. "You'll come with us," he said. "You've got a lot of explaining to do." Reed didn't fight. He just spat at the ground and turned, wrists bound. Clay ran. No one followed. Frank lowered his rifle, his hands finally shaking. He turned to Nakoa. Her hand found his. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. 6 months passed. The land had changed. So had the air. It no longer smelled of dust and ash, but of hay and damp earth, of smoke from the kitchen chimney, and the faint sweetness of sunflowers that Nakoa had planted along the fence. The ranch, once hollow and silent, now pulsed with quiet life. The chicken coop clucked with new hens. The garden stretched behind the house, a patchwork of greens and reds, lettuce, beets, corn. Nakoa woke early, worked late, and learned fast. She kept the books, balanced the numbers, repaired the fence, and stitched the curtains by hand. She also read. Frank taught her at first, awkwardly, slowly. She had memorized every symbol like it was a map back to something she had been denied. Now she wrote lists, letters, and poems she never shared. The shelf by the fire, once bare, now held books worn soft from use. Twice a week she rode south to the settlement near Bear Ridge, where Apache families had taken shelter. Children waited at the edge of the camp, shouting her name when they saw her horse. She brought slates and chalk, stories in both English and Apache, and a tin box of candies she rationed like gold. She didn't speak much to the townsfolk, but they noticed. Mrs. Porter from the bakery left a jar of jam on their gate. Mr. Doran, who once stared hard at her every time she passed, now nodded respectfully when she rode into town. At the fall fair, one of the children she taught placed a ribbon in her hand, blue, with the word teacher scrawled in shaky pencil. Frank watched it all from the edge, never interfering, never claiming it. Then, one morning, as golden light spilled across the porch, he called her name. She stepped outside, hair braided, sleeves rolled, ready for another day's work. Frank stood beside the table. On it lay a single sheet of parchment. Ink glistened on its surface. A pen rested beside it. A small tin box held a stamp and a folded red ribbon. She approached slowly. "What's this?" she asked. Frank looked at her with a softness that had grown behind his eyes, steady as the land. "It's the deed," he said. Her brows knit. "To what?" "To all of it. The ranch, the livestock, the water rights. The name carved into that barn." She stared. "Why?" He folded his arms, looked down once, then back at her. "Because this place is only alive because of you," he said. "Because I was just waiting to die when you came along, because I've watched you build a home out of wreckage, and because no one should ever hold a place they didn't earn. You earned it 10 times over." He held out the paper. She didn't take it. He stepped forward. "I didn't save you, Nakoa. That was never the truth. You saved yourself, and me too." She reached for the parchment. Her fingers touched it, then closed slowly, reverently. He added quietly, "No one's giving you this. You deserve it. You deserve everything you've worked for." The words pierced something buried so deep she didn't know it had roots. She tried to speak, but no sound came. Tears welled up and slid down her cheeks, warm, unchecked. She had not cried when she was taken, when she was beaten, or when she had watched others fall around her. But now, holding proof that she was not someone's burden, not someone's shame or silence, now, she wept. And Frank, standing a few steps away, didn't reach to comfort her. He just stood still, letting her own the moment fully. She clutched the deed to her chest, then she looked at him, and whispered, "Thank you. Not for saving me, but for seeing me." The wind that evening was soft, carrying the smell of dry grass and wood smoke as the sun sank low behind the hills. The sky bled orange and rose into lavender, casting long shadows across the prairie. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes called, their cries lonely but not threatening, just another sound of the land remembering itself. Closer, all was still. The air held that hushed peace that only came when the world was finally willing to exhale. Frank stood in the field behind the house, boots planted firm in the dirt he had once thought would bury him. A small fire crackled before him, its flames licking low and patient against the gathering dark. In his hand was a folded piece of yellowed paper, creased at the edges, its ink smudged by years of sweat, dust, and regret. It was the last piece of it, the last trace of what had brought her into his life. The bill of sale. Her name, misspelled and slanted, a price, $5, a signature half-faded, an ugly artifact of something too deep and human to ever belong on paper. It was more than just a receipt. It was a wound, and he had carried it far longer than he should have. He looked down at it one last time, then held it to the flame. The fire didn't take it at first. It resisted, curling but not catching, as if even the paper knew it was not meant to burn. But then it flared, just once, bright and sudden, curling into black ribbons, before breaking apart in the wind. The ash lifted into the sky like breath, carried west toward the last light of day. Frank watched it go until the last ember disappeared into twilight. Then he turned and walked back to the house. That night, by the flickering glow of the old lantern on his writing table, he opened a ledger. Its leather spine had cracked long ago. The pages inside were yellowed, corners dog-eared. This had once held debts and seed counts, cattle ledgers and rainfall tallies. Tonight it held something else. His hand moved slowly, but without pause. I didn't buy her. I gave up $5 and got back something far greater. I got back the piece of myself I thought was gone, the part that remembers what it feels like to believe in someone else. She was never mine, but she chose to stay, and in that I found the only kind of freedom that ever mattered. He closed the book gently and set it aside. Outside, on the porch, Nakoa waited, wrapped in a wool shawl, her eyes fixed on the stars settling above the dark hills. She sat still, not in silence, but in contentment, her body knowing rest in a way it never had before. Frank joined her, lowering himself into the chair beside her with a soft grunt. The porch boards creaked beneath his weight, but the night didn't mind. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The ranch behind them was quiet. Chickens had settled, the horses were asleep in the barn. The wind stirred the wheat like a lullaby. Above the door, the lantern cast a golden haze that danced across the floorboards, painting everything in the colors of a home finally at peace. Weeks later, Frank made a quiet trip into town, bringing back a wrapped parcel he didn't let her see. He placed it on the kitchen table and told her it was hers. When she opened it, her fingers stilled. Inside was a dress, deep green cotton, hand-stitched, with beadwork so fine it shimmered in the light. She looked up at him, eyes wide. It was simple, but it was beautiful, and more importantly, it was hers. They married in the spring. No preacher, no ceremony scripted in town halls or church steps. Just the garden she had grown, wild flowers curling around a wooden arbor Frank had carved himself. The sky above was open and blue. A handful of neighbors gathered. The children she taught lined the path, each holding a bloom like a promise. There were no speeches, no vows spoken aloud, but when Frank took her hand and whispered with a grin, "Hello, Mrs. Boone," her laugh lit up the garden like sunlight breaking through rain clouds. And he laughed too, soft, amazed. There was no debt between them, no shame, no silence left hanging. Only the quiet, steady warmth of two people who had chosen each other, not out of rescue, not out of need, but out of respect. And under that porch light, as the evening cooled and the prairie breathed, they sat side by side, not as a rancher and his purchase, not as a warrior and her past, but simply as two hearts, finally home. No more chains, no more papers, just freedom and love. If this story stirred something in your chest, if you felt the wind through Dust Hollow, heard the fire crackle beneath the stars, or saw the quiet strength in a woman reclaiming her name, then you've just scratched the surface of what we bring of the frontier, but of hearts that defy the dust, the cruelty, and the silence. Stories of love found in unlikely places, and of people who don't save each other, but stand beside each other. Subscribe now and ride with us through more unforgettable stories of redemption, resilience, and romance in the Old West. Hit that bell, join our campfire, and remember, in a world where everything could be taken, love was the only thing worth giving away.